Thank you again for joining us. It's good to see familiar faces here. I'm Simran Malhotra, principal at Ramey & Associates. We are the lead consultants for the general plan update for the city of Ventura. This is the first of several upcoming educational forums in a series about topics that are pertinent to the general plan update process. We'll have more information later about future events that are scheduled. Today's topic is planning in general and in Ventura in particular. The forum is intended to be fairly informal with a presentation and information on the topic, and then we'll answer any questions that you all might have. This meeting is also being recorded and it'll be available for viewing later on the website, the project website. The presentation will also be posted there. So let's get started. Zoom logistics. I'm sure you're all familiar with Zoom, but I'll walk you through some of the tools just in case as a quick refresher. But first, we have an announcement about Spanish interpretation. Clara?
Sí, muy buenas tardes a todos y bienvenidos. La interpretación es simultánea para esta reunión. Se dará en los siguientes idiomas. Español. Bajo la opción en español, por favor, haga clic en el icono interpretación en su barra de herramientas para acceder al idioma deseado. Va a aparecer un mundito en la parte de abajo de su pantalla. Haga clic en interpretación en el mundito que diga español. Gracias.
Thank you, Clara. I'll give folks a minute or so to switch over.
I'm going to repeat it in English. There will be simultaneous interpreting during this meeting. It's going to be in Spanish and in English. When you find the globe icon that you see to the right-hand side at the bottom of your screen, please make a click on your preferred language, English or Spanish, so that you are able to listen in the language that you prefer.
Thank you, Maria. Okay, there are a few Zoom tools. Firstly, as you all know, you have the microphone button at the bottom of your toolbar, which allows you to mute and unmute yourself. We'll request that you mute yourself until it's your turn to speak. And to unmute, you just toggle that button on and off. Next to that button is the video button, and you can use that to toggle it on and off. You're welcome to keep your cameras off unless you're speaking, but it's absolutely fine to have it on so we can see who all is here. And then the chat feature is available. If you have a question or comment, please use that to type your thoughts in. We'll try and answer those as we go along. And then certainly we'll pause along the way to answer additional questions that you all might have. So let's get started. Joining me in the presentation today will be Peter Gilley, the Community Development Director. And also here assisting is Neda Zayer, who's the Assistant Community Development Director with the City of Ventura and the project manager for this project. She'll be moderating the chat and questions. And from Ramey & Associates, we have Aram Kamali, who is assisting with all things logistics. We also have a lot of members from the General Plan Advisory Committee here, and thank you for being here, and we appreciate your contributions to the process and the time commitment you've made. So thank you for joining us. And I also saw Council Member Doug Holter earlier. Thank you. Say a word or two as a welcome.
Great, thank you very much. No, it's just good to be here tonight, and I'm looking forward to what you have to present and see if we could fill in some of the holes of information that I've learned over my lifetime. And I think it's all going to be very worthwhile for all of us to make sure we're on the same footing as we move into the general plan and form that plan for our future. So thank you all for taking time out tonight to be here.
Thank you, Doug. The presentation today covers an overview of planning and why we should plan. We'll then cover what a general plan is, its components, and what it is required to address. I'll also briefly describe other planning tools that are used to implement the general plan, such as zoning and specific plans. Peter will then talk about these plans in the Ventura context, as well as how the development review process works today. And then finally, we'll summarize other ongoing planning activities in the city. We'll stop a couple of times along the way for questions, and we'll have a lot of time at the end of the meeting as well for that. So let's get started with why cities should plan. Planning provides a tremendous opportunity to bring the community together to establish a clear vision for its future. It also allows cities to be proactive about the topics that are of concern or of importance to that community. And these can range from preserving open space and agricultural lands, as the city did through the SOAR initiative, or addressing risks from sea level rise or wildfire risk, as it is planning to do as a part of this process. Other issues that are often dealt with, and this general plan will deal with, include impacts of growth, the need for more housing, health and equity issues, as well as the desire to build a more resilient economy. These topics evolve from time to time, and by regularly updating the general plan, the city can be preemptive in how it addresses these topics. And then finally, but last but not least, cities are required to plan by the state of California. Planning in California is organized hierarchically. The general plan is the governing plan under which all the other plans nest. We'll talk a little bit more about what's entailed in a general plan, but it covers the entire area within a city as well as its planning areas. And because it's at the highest level, it is very broad in nature, and it establishes the overall direction for the city and the community. There are three next set of plans: sub-area plans, zoning, and functional plans. Sub-area plans are usually locational plans that are focused on portions of cities. These could include a downtown, a coastal area, a community, or any specific area. And these could either take the form of a community plan or a specific plan. A local coastal program, or a LCP, governs the area within the coastal zone. And in Ventura, we have specific plans, community plans, and local coastal program, all of which we'll talk about in more detail later on in the presentation. The next type of plan or tool is zoning, which implements the land use direction that has been established in the general plan. It contains development and use regulations about what can be built on any specific property within a city. And finally, there are functional plans, which are those that address a specific topic. So for example, you can have an active transportation plan, which deals with active transportation elements, including bicycles, transit, walking, and pedestrian activity. The Parks and Recreation Master Plan deals with open space, parks, and recreational programming within a city. And similarly, a climate action plan deals with climate action, adaptation, and resilience. Now let's get into a little bit more detail about general plans and some of these other tools. A general plan is a document that is a roadmap for the future of a city. It starts with establishing a community's long-term vision for the next 25 to 30 years, how a community will change and grow, and what its values and priorities are for its future. It forms the basis of the ground rules that govern development within its boundaries. And based on the vision for the city, general plans establish goals, policies, as well as implementing actions that provide direction to city staff and city commissions and councils in their decision making. So since 2005, which is the last time the city updated their general plan, there have been many changes to the regulatory, physical and economic landscape in Ventura, California, and indeed even this country and the world. The city has dealt with extreme wildfires, with the Thomas Fire, and is today facing dual impacts of climate change and sea level rise. And the world has been impacted by the pandemic, and it's changing the very nature of how we live. The demographics of the city have changed in this time period as well. And since general plans evolve and reflect the community and its values, this general plan update will reflect the city today, and it'll result in a refreshed vision for the next 25 to 35 years. General plans usually are updated every 10 to 15 years, so Ventura is right on track for this update. There are some basic do's and don'ts for general plans that are best practices. For example, a general plan should not try to solve every issue that's facing the city today. It just can't. It also cannot be or shouldn't be overly specific and try to meet every single desire that's expressed in a community. And on the flip side, it can't be so general and vague that there's no direction that's available for the decision makers to follow. What it should do is identify a very clear long-term direction, goals and policies, priorities, and trade-offs that the city council and city staff can use to make decisions in the future. The general plan should set metrics and targets and establish implementation measures through the whole host of other plans that follow or nest under its umbrella. And last but not least, it should establish the land uses and the development patterns within it that govern all real property within a city and its planning area. The state of California, through the Office of Planning and Research, establishes requirements and periodically publishes guidelines for general plans. The last time the guidelines were updated was in 2017. And there are 8 required topics or elements that must be addressed. And I'll walk through these in more detail over the following slides. Cities can also include additional topics that are of interest to their community. In the case of Ventura, we have community design, economic development, arts and culture, and historic preservation. And these are all topics that will be addressed in this general plan update. All these topics do not need to be separated out as listed. And cities have taken different approaches with organization. Peter will talk in a little bit more detail about how the 2005 general plan was organized and the pros and cons of that approach. I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about a sometimes confusing aspect of general plans, and that's related to the boundaries that it covers. There are various geographies that are incorporated in a general plan. The first is self-evident. It is this land within the city limits. The next is the sphere of influence, which is a planning boundary outside of the city limit line that designates the city's probable future boundary and service area. This is determined in conjunction with a local agency, the Local Agency Formation Commission, or LAFCO as it's known. Given how the incorporated boundaries were established, there are sometimes county pockets or islands that are wholly or partly included within the sphere of influence. In Ventura, an example is Satacoy on the far eastern part of the planning area, as you can see on the map right here. Those are county islands, and the city must plan for those. And finally, there's the planning boundary, which is often a larger geography, which is shown in this yellow outline on the map. And it's included to be an area which is of relevance, but the city usually does not have planning authority or jurisdiction over over that land. So now over the next few slides, I will describe each of the land use elements in a little bit more detail, starting with the land use element, which designates the type, intensity, and general distribution of uses of land within the city on all parcels. It also contains, and the types of uses it addresses include housing, commerce, commercial uses, retail, office uses, industrial, open space, education, civic or public buildings and grounds, parks, as well as areas for utilities and other public and private type uses. And it's accompanied by a land use diagram or map, as the one you see on the screen. This is the general plan map, land use map for the city of Ventura today. Besides the distribution, the land use element also contains standards for density and intensity for both commercial or residential and non-residential uses. Residential uses are generally limited by the density number, which is dwelling units per acre, and non-residential units non-residential uses are governed by what's called floor area ratio, which is essentially a number that allows you, that limits how much development can be built on any particular parcel. The land use element must be coordinated with the content of the other elements in the general plan. So for example, the noise element considers the land uses that are in the land use element as it considers impacts related to noise. The circulation or mobility element takes into account how does the transportation network work for the types of land uses that are in the land use element. The next element is the circulation or mobility element, and this identifies the general location and extent of existing and proposed major vehicular thoroughfares, transportation routes, as well as other local public utilities and facilities. These other utilities are sometimes organized in a separate element. The circulation element contains goals and policies for a balanced and multimodal transportation network. And one of the recent legislation that must be addressed in the circulation element is complete streets. And this was a requirement that was put in place in 2011 that states that all streets must be designed to be accessible to all people and all modes of travel. So it should address vehicular needs, transit, pedestrians, bicycles, seniors, children, those who have disabilities. So those aspects must be addressed in a circulation element. And as I noted, it is required to identify both the location and the design at a high level of both existing and proposed street classifications. The housing element is the only element that must be approved by a state agency. The Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, must certify each city's housing element. And the housing element must be updated every 8 years by statute. It's the only element that has this requirement imposed on it. Each city receives a regional housing needs allocation number, or RHNA, for housing that it must plan for. What this means is that the city's general plan and zoning must allow for certain densities for building the lower income units. And this must also, the housing element and the city must also identify vacant or underutilized sites where these units could be built in the near term. We'll spend an entire meeting actually in June discussing the housing element, so please stay tuned for that. The RHNA number for the city of Ventura is 5,300, and the city must plan for that. They don't necessarily have to build it, but plan for it for the time horizon, the 8-year time horizon. The safety element is, again, one of the required elements, and it establishes policies and programs to protect the community from risks associated with seismic, geological, flood, and wildfire hazards, as well as other concerns such as drought and impacts of hazardous materials related to industry. New legislation since 2005 requires that climate change, adaptation, and resilience be addressed in the safety element. The element also is required to provide evacuation routes, address police and service and fire services and facilities, as well as other emergency facilities. A new requirement since 2005 is included, that is a part of SB 1000, which requires that all general plans address health disparities and the environmental justice issues in low-income communities within the area covered by the general plan. The state outlined a 3-step process for this. The first one is the identification of disadvantaged communities, or DACs. These are state-identified or low-income areas within a community with high pollution exposure or other health risks. The next step includes engagement with community members in these areas to identify priorities that should be addressed in the general plan. And then the final step is the integration of goals, policies, and programs that address these disparities. Topics that are to be included in this typically include environmental pollution, such as air quality or water quality related issues, public facilities, parks, schools, medical facilities, as well as access to these, say, built environment related issues such as safe and sanitary homes, so cost of housing and the quality of housing, the ability to walk and be able to get physical activity, which includes, again, access to parks, transportation, transit, and open space. And then finally, other identified health risks such as access to healthy foods, as well as other impacts that are related to social determinants of health, which include population characteristics such as income, race or ethnicity, or educational attainment. The last three required elements are conservation, open space, and noise. Conservation deals with the preservation, development, and use of natural resources, including water, forests, soils, rivers, and mineral deposits. The open space element guides both the provision of adequate public parks and recreational facilities, as well as the preservation of other open space lands or agricultural lands in concert with the conservation element. And finally, the noise element identifies and evaluates noise-related impacts arising from transportation systems and other land uses such as commercial or industrial operations. Now switching gears to zoning. Zoning is an implementation tool that establishes regulations that govern how real property can be developed. It does so with use regulations and development standards and guidelines. And it is required by state law to be consistent with the general plan, land use general plan, which means the land use element. The zoning map establishes zoning for each property in the city, and the zoning code contains the regulations that govern each of those properties. And these typically include a detailed list of which uses are allowed, what the density or intensity is, and how tall a building might be. So building heights are regulated through zoning. Zoning also includes site standards for setbacks, required open space, number and location of parking, off-street parking that is, as well as standards for transitions between uses when there's, say, commercial uses next to residential uses. There's often standards that regulate how that adjacency is handled. Another popular tool, as I had mentioned earlier, is the use of specific plans. And specific plans generally cover areas and are a convenient, smaller areas within a city, and are a convenient way to address area-specific requirements. And these typically establish a more detailed vision, goals, and policies for that area. Examples would include downtowns, large pieces of property, or large areas within the city with multiple parcels, often older commercial corridors or strips, and then areas that fall within redevelopment zones or used to. Specific plans include both development and design regulations or zoning for that area. And in addition, recommendations for the public environment, streetscapes, mobility, and other urban design elements are incorporated. The 5 basic requirements are listed here. And as I just described, and these are specific plans also address infrastructure needs and financing of those infrastructure requirements. There is also specific plans contain implementation measures and need to be consistent with the general plan. An alternative to typical zoning is a form-based code. And form-based codes are based on the principle that the building form and scale of development and how it relates to the public realm results in more predictable and desirable places. What this means is that instead of focusing on what uses are in any particular building, if the design and the form of the building is predicted and regulated, we will create spaces or areas that are more attractive and in keeping with the community's desire and vision. This diagram shows how form-based codes are intended to get to that level of the complexity and desired space through regulations as compared to zoning. So the diagram on the top shows how conventional zoning would regulate development by the amount of development, how setbacks work, what the parking requirements are, and what the heights are. When you layer on design guidelines, it gives you some more articulation or modulation of what that development might be. Form-based codes take a very different approach where these include build-to lines, have a different way of regulating height by number of floors, and allow for different massing and other techniques to create something that is more of akin to what people would want to see on a block level in the lowermost diagram. And then finally, there have been, as I mentioned earlier, a whole host of legislation that has been passed at the state since the last general plan was adopted in Ventura. And I won't read through all of these, but this is just a sampling of those that of state laws that affect land use as well as housing. And this slide is related to legislation that impacts the safety element. And with that, I will pause for questions that you all might have. There was a lot of information, so I'm sure you all have a lot of questions. I'll stop sharing so I can see you all. Vanetta, do we have any questions that?
Not in the chat feature, Simran.
Okay. Okay. If you have a question, please raise your hand and.
Maybe they'll have more questions after we go through the next layer.
Okay.
Oh, I think I see a hand.
Pete.
Sorry, I almost forgot to unmute. In that last slide, it said something about lowering densities. I was under the understanding we could lower densities on our general plan densities if we raised them other places. Is that true?
Yes, and I can go back to that slide. SB 330 says that you can, there should be no net loss. So if you lower densities in some areas, you need to increase it in others so that overall the capacity within the city is not reduced.
Does that have to do with also with RENA numbers for low income, medium income, and above medium income? Does that have anything to do with that?
Not directly. The RENA numbers, RENA, especially for the lower income RENA numbers, have to be provided for sites that have a certain maximum density, or actually minimum density. 30 units to the acre is the minimum number of maximum density. It's kind of complicated. So you have to allow at least 30 units to the acre, or for it to count for low income RENA. The sites that are identified for RENA must allow 30 units to the acre. If the city downzone certain areas, it needs to make sure that the housing sites are not still continue to allow that minimum requirement.
Okay, so like in Ventura, there's a lot of stuff in Midtown, East Side that are neighborhood low density. How would that fall into then the low income density, the 30 units per acre?
That's a really good question. I think it'll be. I think that's something we should. I'll say let's hold off on answering that question, because as the city goes through the process of identifying housing sites for the housing element, depending on where those sites are, we'll be able to establish what the densities in Midtown are, or any specific part of the city that needs to be, and what potential changes need to be made to accommodate the required RENA allocation.
Okay, thanks.
Simon, can I take a shot at that last question as well?
Of course.
Can we jump back to slide 16? So as Simran said, the very low, the lower income units, so the low and very low, of which it's about 2,000 of the 5,300, those we will have to find sites that have 30 dwelling units per acre. Most of Midtown is currently in the general plan not at that level of density. So there could still be sites that count, housing projects that count towards our RENA. Those may end up being sites that fall more into the moderate. So the minimum density to qualify for low income would only apply to the first two rows.
Thanks for clarifying, Peter.
Yeah, okay, so just to clarify then, so those first two rows, you're talking a couple thousand units, those would have to be 30 units per acre then to fall into those two categories?
That's right.
Okay, so then if we're looking at somewhere that's currently mostly zoned, or mostly not zoned, sorry, designated as neighborhood low density, then those would not be able to fit in those areas?
Yeah, if there was
That's
an
right.
available housing site in that area, it would most likely be the categories for moderate or above moderate.
Okay, and just while we're on this, I was going to ask it later, but we're here. So Peter, do you know why we have 2,300 above moderate income for the city and only a 2,000 lower income for the city?
There's many layers of answers. I did actually watch most of the RENA subcommittee meetings in 2020. If you look at our percentages of at the different income levels, they're close to the percentages of what the county was assigned by SCAG. So that's the first reason. But then you will note that our above moderate is a tad bit higher in percentage, and our very low is a tad bit lower. That's because in this last cycle, the SCAG formula that they developed took into account if a city already had a greater share of the affordable housing in that county. So we got a little less on the very low, and instead we got a little more on the above moderate.
Okay, so you're saying Ventura, the city of Ventura has more lower income than higher income? Because looking at housing prices, that's hard to believe.
If you compare it to the rest of the county.
Okay, interesting, thanks.
Carol?
Hi, since we're talking about RENA, I'm trying to figure out how we got locked into the LA SCAG numbers as opposed to something that's makes more sense for our part of the world.
So Simran, I'm happy to answer that one. We actually benefited from being part of SCAG. If you look at our per capita RENA, we got a lower percentage compared to our population as part of SCAG. Our RENA per population is less. And so had we not been in SCAG, we might have actually gotten more. I know that might seem counterintuitive, but there are other parts of SCAG that because of the formula they worked out, got a greater amount of units per population than Ventura County as a whole did. Part of that is a recognition that unlike the core part of the SCAG area, like the LA area, Ventura County is very different.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. If I can just add on to that, LA County, which is much more dense already and has transit available, and so the formula allowed for essentially focused more development in areas, or more RENA allocation in areas where there were the availability of transit to continue to build on, because SCAG also has additional goals related to vehicle miles travel and reducing dependency on auto travel. Dana?
I would just say that in my mind, it's not an advantage for us to have lower amounts of a lower percentage of affordable housing. I actually think, I'm sort of piggybacking, I don't know what Carol was talking about, and I'm inferring a little bit from what Pete was talking about, but it seems we need more low-income housing and very low-income housing. And so it doesn't strike me actually as an advantage. I get what I just from different perspective, it could be considered an advantage to need more. And because to be required to have more, because I actually think we need more. So that's more of a comment than a question, I realize.
Thank you, Dana. I don't see any other hands, so.
Simran, we have a couple questions in the chat.
Oh, yes. Okay, sure. Do you want to read that out first? And then Pete, I see your hand. Thank you.
Yeah, so the question from Steph, she's asking, how do zoning areas change and who decides?
Sorry, could you repeat that, Aram? You're coming in a little muffled.
Let's see if this is better. How do zoning areas change and who decides?
Okay, that's a good question, very good question, Steph. Zoning will change after the land use plan is is established and the general plan has been adopted. The general plan sets the direction and the zoning implements what that is, what's established in the general plan. So once the city goes through this process, and over the next several months, we'll be developing land use alternatives, and then we'll be developing a preferred land use plan that will be eventually adopted by city council. Once that has been adopted, the next step would be to update the zoning so that it is consistent with that land use plan. So zoning will need to ensure that the same amount maximums for density and intensity are permitted, and the same types of uses are allowed.
Hey, Simran, just going to pop in real quick as a follow-up question. Thank you for that. I guess I'm just confused. Is it like, are you going to give the general plan advisory committee? Is it very specific? Is it like, we're going to see which zones are up for change over the next 5-10 years, or like where, you know, and then we'll provide opinions or directions on that? Or because it's hard for me to know like where there's even an opportunity for the city council to make a zoning change. So I just don't know how specific it would be.
Okay, again, good question. Let me expand on what I said a little bit more. So we are at essentially at the start of this process. We are going through a visioning process right now. We had our first community meeting a couple of weeks ago, and as we go through this process, we will work with you, the GPAC, and the rest of the community to identify areas within the city that should either stay the same or are ripe for change. So that will lead, we'll have a map that the GPAC will have a chance to provide input on and comment on about where change may occur. Based on that, there will be land use alternatives that will be prepared, which will say what could potentially go in the areas of change.
That's super
and that
cool.
will go
Thank you.
through. Okay. All right. And Peter, did you still have a question or?
No, actually, I was going to bring up that people were bringing up there in the chat about zoning versus density. So you you pretty much answered that. I've just noticed though, in some projects in the city, we like on the west side, we had an area, a plot that was zoned M1, which is manufacturing, but ended up putting 30 units of housing on there. And then that was later changed to, the zoning was later changed to meet the project that was approved for that location. So is that what you're talking about?
I'm not aware of the details of this particular project. So Peter, I didn't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Simran, this is the law that says that the general plan allows the housing, but the zoning still does not.
Right. Okay. So, okay, so I can build on that. Pete, the state law says that if the general plan is governed, so that is, if the general plan allows a certain use, the zoning can be overruled. So in this case, seems like that's what happened. The general plan allowed residential uses, even though the zoning was outdated and not consistent. So the general plan designation prevailed, and the project was able to move forward, and the zoning was changed retroactively.
Okay. I don't know, I haven't seen it anywhere on any of our literature that we've been sent, but would it be possible to give a link or posting to the general plan, current general plan density map for the city?
Oh, absolutely. It's actually, and Aram, you can put that in the chat. The project website, planventura.com, has links to all the documents we talked about, all the specific plans in the city, the zoning code, and the 2005 general plan, which contains the land use map as well as all the densities that are permitted as a part of the land use map.
All right, great, thank you.
Okay. Aram, anything else in the chat or?
Yeah, we have a few more. They all seem to pertain to RENA. So the first one is how many of the units will be vacation units for people who want to come and go but don't pay taxes on a yearly basis?
I don't believe RENA has vacation units as a classification. So those are not regulated through that process. Those are vacation rentals are regulated through other city regulations.
Yeah, I think we have a couple more. So why does Ventura, with 13% of the county's population, have 21% of the total RENA allocation?
I think that.
I can touch on that one, and as well as the next one about what influenced the RENA numbers. State law established that this RENA cycle was all formula based. And in past RENA cycles, there were things statewide about certain cities agreeing to build more and other cities not. And the state said that couldn't happen anymore. So the answer to the question about is this round of RENA numbers influenced by anything that may have happened in the past on past RENAs in the county? No, not really. Now, the question, why did Ventura get a larger proportion of the county's RENA allocation? Both Ventura and Oxnard got a much higher proportion compared to population. And that is because based on regional planning documents, Oxnard and Ventura have the potential for higher quality, and higher quality is the state term for it, transit opportunities. And the RENA formula that was used gave cities that had that in the regional plans a greater number. So if you compare our population to our RENA to Thousand Oaks and Simi Valley, who actually have more population, we got a larger number. That's because the formula put more weight on those potential transit corridors. Which does go with the next comment about it seems like housing allocations just per town could miss the mark if it's not looking at transportation and employment. And the last RENA formula did. And so it is worked into it. And in this case, our numbers are larger because of the transit potential.
I'll also remind everyone that we do have a whole meeting on just housing and the housing element coming up. The date for it is June 14th. It'll be a joint GPAC and educational forum. So if you can put a hold on your calendars for that. We'll do one more question and then we'll move on to the next part of the presentation. I see Melissa's hand raised. Melissa, go ahead.
Yeah, hello. So my question is, I was the one that asked about taxes and, you know, I'm from Ventura, I lived here, I'm a teacher, I can barely afford a 1-bedroom rental off of the avenue. And what I've noticed is that a lot of beachfront properties, a lot of views, especially with the ones going in right off the 101, people come in and buy them as vacation destination. So how would we prevent that from happening so this doesn't raise the property value when it's unrealistic? When people come in, they stay for a couple weeks, because they can afford to buy it.
Yeah, that's certainly an issue that we should think about more. I don't have an answer for you as to how exactly to deal with that right now, but we'll certainly make a note of it. And as we go through this process, we can consider as to how to address that. I'll also talk about it a little bit more at the end of the meeting, but there is an ongoing survey on the project website, which does have an opportunity for you to add your questions or comments for what the general plan should deal with. So I encourage you to do that. So if you go to planventura.com, right from the homepage, you can link to those visioning activities and share your thoughts and concerns there. Okay, Peter, did you want to present on Ventura planning in the city of Ventura now?
Yes. Thank you, Simran. So we're going to take go down another layer with the land use items. And so Simran went over in general what a lot of the state laws and rules are. We're going to talk a little bit more about Ventura's policies. Next slide. So our general plan was adopted in 2005. Prior to that, the prior general plan was in 1989. The organization of our current plan is different than kind of the state template of having a land use element, a housing element, a circulation element. It instead was broken down into sections based on the vision. And that may have been very appropriate and applicable at the time, but it hasn't aged as well. It makes it a little harder to work with the document. As new laws come forward, we're required to amend the safety element. Well, that actually requires a little more figuring out of what parts of which sections of the general plan do we need to update in order to meet state law. So one of the things that we've heard from those in the public that have worked with our general plan was a request to see if we can make the new one organized more consistently. We don't have to, but that's going to be a topic of conversation as we move forward. Next slide. So these were shown in Simran's slides, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about them. And for everybody who wants to follow along a little more closely, because clearly these slides are small, if you go to planventura.com and then go to the library and look at the background documents, you can pull up the general plan and see a larger version of these maps. Simran walked through the land use map, which is also called the general plan diagram. That's figure 3-5. It shows color-coded version of what the land use designations of all the properties in the city are. So the yellow to browns, those are residential only, and you can see, understandably, most of the city is in the low density residential. You'll see commerce in red, industry in gray, and agriculture in the darker green, with parks and open space in the lighter green. Very similar to the slide that Simran showed before. Now, the general plan, the 2005 general plan, decided to focus growth in certain parts of the city. And those are shown on the image to the right. This is figure 3-1. If you're in the general plan PDF, that happens to be page 45 of that PDF. It shows that the main areas where change was going to occur, it was all going to be infill, because it was a major policy in the 2005 plan that instead of expanding our borders into ag land, and you've heard of SOAR and going into the hillsides, et cetera, if we're going to grow, it's going to be infill, not sprawl. And in that way, Ventura was ahead of its time. Today, the state is almost mandating that cities avoid sprawl. Ventura was already had the policies in place 20 years ago. So the change areas show they're mostly downtown, the major street corridors, and some of the industrial areas are the primary places where a lot of where the major growth was anticipated is happening. Now, I want to give a caveat. That doesn't mean there wouldn't be any other development that might happen anywhere else. But the expectation and goal of the city's policies was that it would happen mostly in these areas. Next slide. Then at the next level is a lot of discussion, not just about how many units might be on a property, which is what the density on the land use map might say, but what form should this growth take? That's where you hear all the discussion about the form-based codes, but it started with the 2005 general plan that laid out transects, which are basically types of building form from rural all the way to urban. And the nomenclature uses T zones, T for transect, T1 through 6. And if you look through our specific plans, you'll actually see references to T3, T4, T5. For example, our downtown is the only part of the city that has the T6 and T5 urban core allowed, whereas some of the other parts might allow T3 and T4 and such. So it was very much built into the general plan to think about the form of the development, not just how many units per acre it might be. Next slide. So then we go into, we have these maps that show how many acres are in certain designation. That can all be translated into numbers. And so table 3-1, which is on page 43 of the general plan PDF, it takes the acreage calculation, what is on the ground and what could be built, and it has columns for what the capacity will be. Now, I want to be very clear. The capacity is not an expectation it will be built. It is if everything were built at or near the maximum allowed, how much might that be? And so in 2005, or 2004 was actually when the existing development was looked at, there were about 39,000 housing units in the city. Right now we're at about 43,000. The land use map adopted in the general plan theoretically could have allowed 29,000 more units, 57,000 more square feet of non-residential. Again, all theoretical, but if every parcel were built to near the max, that's what the result would be. So when the conversation about no net loss, because the new state law that Simran mentioned talked about, you can lower the density in some areas, but you got to raise them in other areas. Those are some of the numbers that we're going to have to be working with on the topic of no net loss. Next slide. Now, this table is way too small to see on your screen unless you have really good eyes. This is table 3-2. Again, if you pull up the PDF of the general plan, this is on page 44 of the PDF itself. This was the projected development numbers by area that staff studied for the general plan update. This is for two reasons. One, to have that projection, but also for the environmental review of the project. If you could scroll down. Like if you show the last line. So while theoretically the plan could have allowed 29,000 more units, the growth projections of the 05 plan out to 2025 anticipated possibly 8,300 units. Since we're at 4,300 units right now, 43,000, sorry. based on about 37 in the past. We haven't built all that, but that just shows that the types of numbers that you're talking about when you project it out over a whole city. If you think about the state's requiring us to plan for 5,000 more units, that sounds like this huge number. But when you account for the fact that our existing general plan has a lot of capacity already there, it's about finding the sites that qualify for the state rules and tying those to those sites in the housing element. Next slide. So then a very important aspect of the general plan process is implementation. Creating the general plan establishes the policies, but then as Simran showed, there's multiple layers of regulation after that. Next slide. So as Simran mentioned, we have a number of specific plans and community plans and corridor plans in the city, as well as special development codes. In general, except for the auto center specific plan, most of these areas are using a form-based code because that was called for in the 2005 general plan. I do want to note that the area shown for the west side and the harbor, those plans were started but never finished. So we have draft documents, but there's nothing actually in place. So the form-based codes that were talked about in the general plan are applied primarily in the areas shown on this map. That means the areas not on this map are just using the regular zoning. Next slide. And so this is our zoning map, which in some way, it probably looks the same to you as a land use map, primarily because the color choices are pretty much the same. But it is different because this goes into a lot more refinement, as Simran mentioned, the specific uses, specific heights, specific setbacks in each zone that have to be applied to each parcel. Next slide. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, these documents, both the general plan, the maps, the specific plans and such, are in the library section of the planventura.com site. Next slide. I thought there was a slide on the development process, but let me just, Aram, do you know if it's still there or should I just speak to it as best I can?
Sorry, Peter. Why don't you start while I pull that up?
Okay.
Apologies, got left out.
So the development process, we're not going to talk about it much, but we want to talk about it at least to give context of how it relates to the general plan. The process is defined in the zoning ordinance, whereas the general plan is going to set the high level goals, objectives, and such. Here we go. The regulations and processes themselves are in the specific plan and zoning code. And so what happens is, unless the city owns a property, which there are some properties we own, but for the most part, most development occurs on private property. A property owner or a potential developer who enters into a contract to buy a property, they apply for a project. It comes to city staff, we review it for consistency with the general plan. We review it for consistency with specific plans and zoning codes, and it goes to public hearings and a final action is taken. So there is a relationship, but the general plan is not going to decide what projects is going to be approved or not directly, but it influences it greatly because currently, as shown, the general plan allows quite a bit of growth in certain areas of the town. And so when a private property owner chooses to apply, those get processed and go to hearings. And that was going to be all we were going to touch on the development process and hand it back over to Simran, because I think the next part is the other initiatives we're doing, unless you want to stop for questions here.
Yes, why don't we stop for questions?
I'll ask my question. I just posted this one. So because of the ongoing drought and limited access to water, what's the process of reconciling the need for all these housing units with the lack of access to water as an ongoing issue, as well as the current drought we're going through?
So Simran, let me answer that because it actually just came up last night.
Okay.
The state doesn't let us use water as a reason not to allow housing construction. One of their laws I don't know if it was on the list that Simran showed, but there are laws that say you can't do that. Because honestly, if you could, every city would use that as their reason. We are required to take appropriate steps in order to get water sources. And the council just had a big meeting last night on that topic. So that's why we're still moving forward.
Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Pete, go ahead.
Yeah, Peter, you mentioned at the beginning when you started about infill, and I was wondering how, like, ag land, and I'm specifically thinking of two parcels that are off Telegraph Road, just east of Hill, so east of Victoria. They're currently orchards. They're in the sphere of influence, but they're not within the city limits. How would those relate to infill?
In general, our policies are that I believe that's land protected by SOAR. It would have to go through the SOAR process if the owner ever wanted to try to annex it and have it developed. And I don't believe the past general plan accounted for any growth on that parcel at all. And unless there was a very strong sentiment from the public to change that, I would think this update isn't going to modify that approach.
Okay, so even though they're in the city's sphere of influence, they still would fall under SOAR?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, thanks.
Properties that are within the sphere of influence, even though the city plans for it, those are still governed by the county zoning and county general plan. So it can be a little confusing. So if the city or a property owner chooses to annex into the city, then the city's general plan would apply. But while that area is within the sphere, the county general plan and zoning will control.
You want to go through some of the questions in chat? I think there were lots.
Yes, let's do that.
There's several comments. Go a little earlier and find a question. We have one asked by John Ritchie.
Go ahead, Aaron. Yeah, go ahead, Aaron.
Okay, there was one asking, how do you make affordable housing profitable to a developer?
Simran, do you want to answer that first?
Sure. And the question for those who couldn't hear clearly, how do you make affordable housing affordable for or profitable for developers? The financing for affordable housing projects is very complicated, and I'd venture to say it's not for the faint of heart. It is not something that's easy to do. in terms of, because it's not necessarily profitable on the face of it, market rate, given the high prices, obviously market rate housing is more profitable for any developer. Having said that, there are state grants, loan programs, etc., that affordable housing developers use to fund their projects. In addition, through state regulations which allow for certain waivers from development standards and development regulations, affordable housing developers can use a density bonus to build more units that help cover the cost of the affordable units. So you can get up to actually now with the recent changes, you can get almost up to 100% of density bonus based on the type of affordable unit mix that you are proposing. But previously, it was limited to a 35% density bonus, depending on how much extremely low or low, very low or low income units that you had. Developers can get exemptions on height, on some setbacks, open space requirements, sometimes parking requirements, depending on what their project is. If they can demonstrate that there are financial feasibility reasons for them to need those exceptions or waivers. Peter, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
No, I think you covered it. I mean, there's certain developers that they specialize and focus on affordable housing, and there's certain developers who focus on market rate and only do enough affordable just to get the benefits or meet an inclusionary housing requirement. So one of the main things that the city deals with is we don't choose who enters into the deal to purchase the property. We don't choose which type of developer, whether it's a for-profit or affordable housing developer. We take the application that's received, we compare it with our regulations and bring it forward. There's sometimes a misconception about the level of control that the city might have with exactly what is proposed on a private property.
I'll also add, one way cities can encourage more affordable housing is to put in place an inclusionary housing requirement that says that every parcel, every housing development needs to have a certain percentage of the units that are affordable. Ventura does not have that yet, but I believe that is something that's under consideration at the city.
We do have that for ownership units. It's just that we have not updated the ordinance for the new law that allows us to require it for the rental units as well again.
Thanks for correcting that, Peter. Neda, any other comments or questions from the chat?
And also answering them in the chat. Aram, anything you see that we haven't addressed?
Let's do one more. So this is from Kathy. What do we have to do to break neighborhood high, which is general plan designation, into multiple segments? We need to step up gradually adjacent to existing communities.
So that's something the general plan can definitely do. What the final general plan map looks like and what the actual designations are is yet to be determined, but certainly adjacency and graduating from the lower density, so there's appropriate transitions to the higher density, is something that the general plan should and will address. And that can be done both in terms of how the land use designations are created, but also with policies that translate into design standards that require projects to have appropriate transitions to protect existing residential neighborhoods.
And along those lines, just want to, chime in. If there's community support to do that type of transitions, we're completely on board.
Looks like the others were answered by Netta in the chat.
Okay, great. Then we'll go through the last part of this presentation. And this is to essentially describe some of the other planning efforts that are interrelated to the general plan and how these are being developed concurrently. These include the update of the city's, well, besides the update of the general plan, there are several implementing plans that are happening. They're either a part of the update process or they're separate efforts that are ongoing. These include an update to the local coastal program. Peter mentioned earlier that it is currently in place, but it wasn't updated when the 2005 general plan was adopted. So I'll talk about that in a minute. There's also a climate action and resilience plan, as well as active transportation plan that are underway. And then the last plan that's ongoing is a historic context statement and survey. All these plans will be coordinated and to maintain consistency and efficiencies in terms of both the technical analysis and the policy recommendations that are in these plans. And then the community engagement tied to all of these plans will be coordinated as well, so as to not create any confusion and also not overburden the community with meetings that they need to attend. So starting with the local coastal program, the local coastal program is intended to govern development in the coastal zones, and a local coastal program must be reviewed and certified by the California Coastal Commission after it's been adopted by the City Council. LCP generally contains a land use plan with measures specifying the location type and the scale of uses. As you all know, the Coastal Commission's mission or charge is to ensure that the coast is public access to the coast, and tied to that, they look at the uses that are allowed as a part of a general plan or which are incorporated in the local coastal plan from that lens. The 2005 general plan was not updated, or the local coastal plan program was not updated to incorporate the 2005 general plan, so it still operates under the umbrella of the 1989 general plan. There were parts of it that were updated when the downtown specific plan was put in place. Portions of the LCP were updated to address the downtown plan at the time. But for the rest of the areas within the coastal zone, the 1989 general plan is still referred to. As a part of this process, we are preparing a climate action and resilience plan, and this is intended to address climate change, adaptation, and resilience, and to deal with the anticipated impacts of climate change. These impacts include wildfires, sea level rise, extreme heat, as well as other natural hazards, including flooding. The CARP, as it's called, will have actions and strategies to both mitigate the impacts, but also how to address limiting greenhouse gases and meet the targets that have been established by the state for reduction of GHG emissions across a variety of sectors. So from energy use, transportation use, and as well as building design. Some of these are tied to state codes, but there are other actions that cities can take to help meet these reduction targets. The other two related projects that are ongoing, which are standalone projects, include the active transportation plan, as well as the historic resources survey and context statement. The last time a historic survey was done for the city was in the 2000s and then early 2011, but the survey was not certified by the city council. So the goal at this point is to complete the survey and have it be incorporated in some manner in the general plan as a part of the historic preservation element. The active transportation plan, which deals with active mobility type uses, as I mentioned, bicycle use, transit use, pedestrian use, and that will be consistent with the general plan and the mobility element or the circulation element, and will contain specific recommendations for making those improvements. Two of the recently completed plans are the senior strategic plan as well as the street tree master plan. With that, we'll pause again for some questions that you all might have. I'll stop sharing again. I see there's some questions in the chat as well.
While people get kind of warmed up on questions, I want to build on something that Simran mentioned, that updating our local coastal program is so important, because basically the 2005 general plan does not apply to the coastal zone because we never updated our LCP. And so the 1989 comprehensive plan applies in the coastal zone. As we're going to be talking about such important issues of sea level rise and sustainability and such, it's important that those policies, goals, and rules apply to the whole city. So that is why council made the LCP amendment as part of the scope of this project.
Questions? Aram, are there any in the chat that?
Yeah, we had one regarding the availability of the street tree master plan. Netta responded. She said she's going to look into it to see whether we can provide a final draft.
Great, thank you. Yes, Dana. Okay.
The coastal plan just seems really ginormous, really important. If we're talking about 30 years ago, the understanding of where we were going to be is way different. And I'm just wondering how feasible it is. I mean, there's so many constraints around so many things that, you know, we have big ideas and that we really want to do these big things, and then there are these constraints around it. But I think I looked at a picture of from, I think it was that maybe the 2005 general plan. There was a photograph in there at Surfers Point, and how much further out the sand went in that photograph than currently exists now, 15 years later. And so the California Coastal Commission, are they, I'm just wondering what the obstacles and what the opportunities are for us to really address the whole issue of, climate change, sea level rise, and the big stuff we're going to have to do. So that's a very general question, and I'd love to begin this long process, I guess.
Yeah, thank you, Dana. That's a really good question and an important one. Climate change has risen to the top as one of the issues that the city must address in this general plan update. The vision that's established in the general plan for the entire city, including the coast, and then the strategies to deal with climate change, especially those related to sea level rise, flooding, erosion, etc., will be a part of the general plan and the climate action and resilience plan. What the local coastal program will do is to take those strategies and work through the process with the Coastal Commission to get their approval. And there's obviously there's a lot of discussion and back and forth with the Coastal Commission and staff there to make sure that those two are aligned. It is a longer term process, and sometimes once it'll start during the general plan, while the general plan is being prepared, so that they are involved in these discussions early. But occasionally, and actually quite likely, the actual certification by the Coastal Commission will follow the adoption of the general plan.
So although, what are the constraints or the opportunities to really do? I mean, I walk my dogs over at the point a lot. And, I just keep watching the pathway get skinnier because parts of it fall away every winter. And I mean, it seems to me that this then involves the fairgrounds and it just does seem like there's so many layers and levels to this. How complicated is this going to be, I guess, is another part of my question.
The short answer, Dana, is that it'll be very complicated. And that's the truth of it. There are so many different strategies. Even when we look at how do you address impacts of climate change with sea level rise, you have managed retreat, you have hardening of the coastline, you have reconstruction of the coastline, you have a whole variety of different options. So the city and the community will first need to come to a common understanding and vision for what that should be. What is the right thing? Do we want to talk about managed retreat, for example? These are all open questions that we'll talk about over the next several months and year or so. Once that general direction has been established, that's when we begin to have those discussions with the Coastal Commission to see how those two how the local coastal program can accommodate both the Coastal Commission's mission, but also what the city's desires and goals are. Pete?
Yeah, just to answer Dana's question, I believe the point down there, Surfers Point, and the bike path is all part of a managed retreat program from the city, if I remember correctly.
Does anyone know, is that so? I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, if not, I think we'll have to try and look it up on the city site or somewhere, but I believe it is.
I do remember that being mentioned in the past. I don't know if there's a specific document or a plan around that, but I know I've heard that brought up in the past, that there is a managed retreat there.
We can check into that and bring more information back on that. I'm sorry, I don't have that answer right now. Pete, did you have a question as well?
No, that was it. I just wanted to see if I could answer Dana's question.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Go ahead, Aram.
We're good in the chat for now.
Okay. I see, Tara, you added in the chat for the Ventura Surf Riders Rider organization. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, and Jane Montague said that it is a part of a managed retreat.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Okay. Well, if there aren't any more questions, if everything was crystal clear, let me go back to the presentation and talk about some of the upcoming meetings. So as I mentioned at the outset, we have a series of educational forums coming up where we'll be doing a deep dive on various topics, starting with one on economic and market conditions that's coming up on June 3rd, so in about 2 weeks. Following that, we have a forum on June 15th about the housing element and an overview on the topic of housing. That is going to be a joint meeting with the General Plan Advisory Committee. The following month, we'll talk about health equity and environmental justice. And in August, we'll talk about transportation and mobility. We have several GPAC meetings coming up as well, and these are all open to the public, so I encourage you all to attend. There'll be 2 meetings in June about housing, one on June 15th, which is combined with the educational forum, as I mentioned, and then second meeting on housing, which would be on June 29th. The July 20th meeting, and the GPAC generally meets on the third Tuesdays of the month, will be on vision and guiding principles. There are opportunities open right now for community input. We have an online visioning survey or several exercises for the members of the community to provide feedback. There are 3 activities. These can be found on the project website, planventura.com. And you can give us your big ideas, your magic genie ideas of what can happen in the city in the future, what you'd like to see there, your thoughts on the vision that was included in the 2005 general plan and how that might change. And then you can on a map indicate your ideas about any specific part of the city. So you can drop in a marker and say, build a park here or build whatever you like in any location. We are also going to be meeting with the community councils over the next couple of months, giving them an update as to where we are with the general plan. So we'll be going to their regularly scheduled meetings over the summer. And then we are having holding community listening sessions with specific groups to encourage additional participation. These are groups that have been identified as those who haven't been as involved in the process to date, and we want to make sure that their voices are heard as well. This last slide just lists how to access the project website. If you have questions, you can email them to the email address on the screen, and then sign up for additional updates. While folks are taking down that information, Kelsey, I see your hand up if you want to unmute and share, ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. My question was just on what kind of safeguards are there to make sure that the plans in place, the projects proposed actually abide by them, as well as the underlying local or specific plans?
That's a good question. That is a part of the review process that the city staff goes through when a project comes in the door for review. And I'll have Peter talk about that a little bit more, but the city reviews each plan for consistency with the general plan, as well as the zoning or specific plan that's in place for that particular property, and then makes findings about consistency with those documents. And then the process includes review by the Planning Commission, or the Design Review Committee, if the project falls in that category, and then finally the City Council. Peter, if you wanted to add something to that, feel free.
No, I don't have anything to add, but if you have a specific case you want to talk about, we're happy to talk to you about it.
I guess I'm just referring to some projects that have recently been approved that do have violations against the specific plans or the general plan. And so once those projects are approved and reviewed, if there are inconsistencies with the plan, is there anything to make sure that we actually are following the guidelines of the plan?
If there is a project that has been approved that doesn't comply with the general plan, please let us know, because those shouldn't get approved. At all the zoning levels, there are exception and variance processes that are available to applicants. So those may be done in some of those cases. So again, if you have some specifics, happy to talk to you about them.
Okay.
There's a question in the chat asking if the community outreach and meetings for the historic preservation project has started. And Neda, maybe you can jump in here, but I believe those meetings will be starting over the next couple of months.
Sure, Simran. Yes, they'll be starting over the next couple of months. The first step they've taken is they did meet recently with the Historic Preservation Committee, and we'll be planning further outreach. We did get feedback from them with some ideas, and so we wanted to take that first step and get some information from the Historic Preservation Committee before reaching out to the community. So we'll make sure to post that information and keep everyone apprised.
Great, thank you, Neda. Carol, I see your hand up. Carol, you're still muted.
Okay, I'll start again. Thank you. I'm just going to piggyback on what Kelsey asked, and I don't have a specific project in mind, but when builders are granted variances or concessions based on, for example, low income or moderate income housing, how do we follow up on that? How long does that last? What is there a committee? Is there a group? Is there someone that checks on that to ensure that that is being enforced?
Are you asking is how the affordable housing units that are being provided is being tracked and monitored?
Yes.
Yeah, so they have to enter into a 55-year agreement that's based on state law, and we have staff that handle that. And they have to enter into contracts and such, and those need to all be done prior to occupancy.
And does someone follow up on that and monitor it for the next 55 years?
Yes, we actually have a contract with the Housing Authority. They do that work on behalf of the city.
Okay, thank you.
So just to, I mean, you want to ask for a specific project, so I'll offer one up. The new project along the 101. So there are issues currently in place and they've been granted occupancy even though there are style guidelines that have not been met, whether it's parapet walls or, you know, bigger things like the railroad crossing improvement. How do we make sure that things like that don't happen?
So before Peter answers, if I can just answer your question more at a more global level. State law essentially says that if affordable housing units are being provided in a project, the developer is entitled to request waivers to make that project affordable or pencil out for them. So in that sense, the city's hands are generally tied in how much in granting of those waivers, because those are dependent on what's requested by the developer. So sometimes these waivers involve some of the what are considered more quality related pieces, like additional design articulation, or parapet walls, or some elements such as that, and there is a limited flexibility that the city has to deny those. And Peter, I don't know if you wanted to talk about that specific project.
Sure, and Kelsey, if you have specifics about projects, we could talk more offline on a particular project, but I think you're referring to Coastline, which is under construction right now.
I actually wasn't going to bring anything up. Peter just asked for specific projects so I thought I'd offer an option up.
Sure, and if there's specific examples or points of Coastline that you want to discuss, I'm happy to do so. They are under construction, so the project isn't complete, and so there are still conditions they do have to work through and features they still have to build out, and so that's under heavy observation and inspection by the city with the developer going on right now. But if there's concerns you have or that you're seeing with that project as it's being constructed, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to go through those issues with you.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Oh, well, hearing none, I'll thank you all for your time this evening. I know you're all busy, and appreciate you taking a couple of hours of your very important evening time to join us. Hope this meeting was useful and informative, and we look forward to seeing you at our upcoming meeting. Our next meeting, as I mentioned, is on June 3rd, and we'll be talking about economic development and related topics. So thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.